I'm going to talk about, this is the talk title that I put that was up on the meetup group. But this is kind of generally a bunch of new things that we're working on at Docker, and also a new process that we're experimenting with for open design and how everyone can get involved in the design of Docker. So I'm from Docker. I used to work, I started a company called Orchard, where we built tools around Docker. There was a hosting service called Orchard, and a developer environment tool called Fig. In June we got acquired by Docker, and we have become Docker London. We are a new engineering office in London, actually building Docker in London, which is quite exciting. Because normally when Silicon Valley companies start an office in London, it's just an office, well, not that it's a bad thing, but it's normally just an office for the salespeople and nothing actually gets made here. But we're starting with an office of engineers actually building things in London. And we're working on, at the moment we're working on the open source Docker project, building some new orchestration features to make Docker work better in production, which is some of the things I'll be talking about today. And we'll also be working on some new things as well, which I can't talk about right now. But I don't want this to be a pitch, but if you like Go and you like working on open source projects and might want to do that full time, come and talk to me afterwards. But the main thing I want to talk about today is open design of Docker. Docker is an open source project. And we're kind of experimenting at the moment with a new process of how Docker gets built. Because open source companies are in this kind of odd situation where the customers, the people who use the product, can actually have a direct influence on it by actually working on it themselves. And Docker has sort of grown like that. We have, we have sort of 700 contributors or something who have contributed to the projects, and they're certainly not all from Docker, the company. In the moment, a lot of the Docker development sort of happens behind closed doors, whether that's literally inside the Docker offices in San Francisco with people talking to each other, or whether it's on the IRC channels. And the IRC channels sort of, on the surface, seem like a sort of open medium, but they're pretty useless unless you're sitting on the IRC channel 24/7 trying to figure out all of the activity that's going on. So what we want to sort of do is try and make the process of how Docker is built as open and easily accessible as possible. And, oh, sorry, my notes have gone. Anyway, there are a bunch of ways that we're starting to do this. One of the ways is that we want to sort of try and split apart the Docker open source projects and the company that's behind it. Because the company that's behind it originally started as DocCloud, and Docker was just sort of a little open source project inside of it, which was maintained as an open source project. So Solomon, who happened to run the company called DocCloud, also was the sort of open source PDFL of this open source project, and the two things ran in parallel. So DocCloud wasn't even built on Docker; it was just a project that was supporting. Turns out Docker was quite a big deal, and they turned the whole company into a thing that supported Docker. But that sort of idea has remained with the company Docker Inc. And we want to start making that a kind of semi-official thing, where the Docker open source project does run as an independent thing. And so we set up this thing called Docker Governance, what the acronym is, it's something like the Docker Governance Board, which is essentially made up of a bunch of people who, it includes Docker Inc., but it's also made up of a bunch of people who either work on the project or use the project at their company, basically to set a high-level direction for the project So it's useful to all those people, and all those people have a say in how it works. We recently held the first meeting for that. The notes are up on our blog, which is blog.docker.com. Basically, talking about how it's going to work. And the way it sort of works at the moment is the Docker Inc. obviously hires a lot of people who work on Docker, the open source projects. And we also want the other companies who work on it to have basically an equal say, like be on an equal standing as Docker Inc. to have a say about how the project works. In terms of contributions, about 50% of the pull requests on the Docker projects are open by Docker Inc. employees. The other 50% are other companies working on Docker and just individuals who want to contribute to Docker, which is quite impressive considering we have, I think almost a dozen developers working on the open source project at the moment. But one of the problems is that the pull requests that get opened by Docker Inc. employees have a much higher chance of getting merged than people who aren't Docker Inc. employees. And part of the problem of that is internally as Docker Inc. we sort of have this idea about where we want to take Docker, and we have other colleagues and the people who are going to merge those pull requests to basically go and have a chat with in real life and say, oh, I've got this idea, what do you think about this? And then you can sort of talk with the core developers and figure out the right design for it. The people outside Docker don't really have that same chance. They'll work on a pull request and they'll submit this pull request that they think is a really good idea, but the sort of Docker core developers who have this idea about the vision of Docker and where it's heading will just say, this is crap, it doesn't fit into what we want to do. And that's a problem because somebody's had a good idea, something that's useful for them, something which might be useful for other people, but they just haven't had a chance to make it into the well, not the right thing for Docker, that's sort of the wrong way to put it, but a thing that could potentially be merged into the projects and sort of fits in with the projects as a whole. So what we're trying to put together is a proposals process for how changes might get made in Docker. And these are essentially done, it's kind of started off as a really kind of chaotic, a sort of turning what was a chaotic process into something that's kind of semi-organized, because people were doing this before, where they were just submitting GitHub issues, which is like, oh, I have this really cool idea for a feature, and then people would start talking about it on GitHub. We thought, oh, well, people are already doing this, why don't we sort of turn this into a thing? So you can now create, if you create an issue which is prefixed with proposal, we'll sort of treat it as a sort of proposal for a new thing to Docker. There are some instructions in the contributing guidelines to Docker about how these proposals should be structured. But generally it's just like, here's this idea I have for Docker. It's also useful if they have maybe a video demonstrating how it works, probably or even just a little example of how the command line would work in a bit of text. It's also quite neat if they come as pull requests which are changes to the documentation, because then it's a really good way to explain a new feature if it's made as a change to the documentation. And people have been starting to do this now, and we obviously encourage anyone to do this as well. If you have an idea for Docker, to just submit an issue on GitHub, which is called proposal and is an idea for Docker. And then what happens is people start talking about it, the community starts talking about it, the Docker employees start talking about it, and you soon get an idea as the person who wants to make this thing of whether it's a good idea or not. Generally, if everyone says this is a terrible idea, then it's probably a terrible idea. If almost everyone says it's a terrible idea, but one person says, oh, this might have some hope, that is probably a good idea. And you can sort of adjust it to sort of fit what everyone, because as sort of things, as internet threads about software go, it's generally people saying it's terrible. But you can sort of adjust it to, you can sort of get some useful positive feedback out there and sort of adjust it to something that might turn into something good. What I'm going to do today is basically go through some of those proposals, because these are, in fact, three things that we're working on internally at Docker Inc. but we are doing the same process that anybody else outside the company would also do, where we're first proposing it as a GitHub issue on GitHub, and sort of asking the community, what do you think of this? First of all, it's actually quite a big change, which hasn't got much exposure yet, which is an idea for a clustering system for Docker. So currently, Docker works really well on a single computer. So you start the Docker daemon, and you get a REST API, which the Docker client talks to, and you can start containers on this daemon. You can link containers together, all on this single daemon, and which is pretty good, except most systems will be running across multiple machines. And as soon as you step onto multiple machines, you sort of have to figure it out for yourself. Like Docker doesn't really help you in that regard. It just sort of sits on a single machine and knows what's on a single machine. And we kind of want Docker to work out the box on multiple machines, kind of to solve the initial sort of N+1 problem of running production, where everybody's going to need more, unless it's something really, really small, everybody's going to need multiple machines. And the initial idea is that it will work a bit like a daemon, except somehow you can also point it at another daemon, or something else which knows where another daemon is. And then all of these daemons will be aware of the other daemons that are running, or what else is running on these other daemons. So when you call the REST API, like the client does, it will not just list all of the containers that are running on that single daemon, it will list all of the containers running across all of the daemons that are connected together. Now there are a bunch of ways of doing this already, things like Kubernetes and things like Mesos, and CoreOS are doing this as well. And they're obviously, good things, and they're doing things that will work really well in production. But we kind of want a way to answer the question of, how does Docker work outside, initially work out of the box? But we also want it to work with all of these other tools as well, because that's kind of the point of Docker, is that it works well with lots of things. It helps, lets you run any piece of software or anything. So what it would probably be, and this is actually the reason why I'm standing here with this link on the wall, is because we don't quite know what it is yet. And what it will probably be is, it'll probably be something like a plugin system where out of the box, you can connect a few Docker daemons together and it will work. But it probably won't scale to very large scale. And for that, you probably want to use something like Mesos. But then if you want to use Mesos, you can swap out our sort of simple clustering system with something like Mesos, and you'll get the same APIs, but it will be using a different cluster scheduling system. It's sort of the same way that you can package up a piece of software into a Docker image and know that it will run lots of things. You can write things for the Docker OS API and know that it will work against lots of different clustering systems in production. So that's the kind of idea for that. We're not working on that in London. This is something the team in San Francisco is working on. And it is still very early days. There is a prototype on this pull request. This pull request is actually one of the proposals, which is a pull request for the documentation. So the proposal is actually, this is what the documentation will look like in a world where Docker clustering exists. And it's got a video of how it works. It's got links to code and lots of people talking about it and getting angry and giving constructive feedback, hopefully. That's clustering. There'll also be a chance for, I found out this talk's going to be a lot longer than it is, so than I thought, so there'll be a lot of time afterwards for questions. And this is, in fact, the whole point, is that, we should be talking about these things. So if you have comments and suggestions about this is quite a good time to talk about it. One of the things we're going to work on in London is a thing we're sort of preliminarily calling grouping and composition. If you've seen a thing we built at Orchard, which is called Fig, Fig is a tool for running development environments in Docker. It's basically a way of defining a bunch of Docker containers that describes how they connect together, and it has a single command, fig up, for starting them and connecting them together. And that's really good for development environments because you normally have things like a database and a web server, and it needs to know how to connect together. And Docker hasn't been very good at that in the past. It's normally only been quite, from a UI perspective, it's normally been only quite good at running a single container. And this is kind of a similar problem to the clustering thing, where you can run a single container like your web application, but then as soon as you want to run a database and run alongside it, you sort of need to cobble together a few commands and figure out how to link them together and how to name them and stuff like that, and it's just kind of a pain. And you normally write a bash script to do that. And that's the kind of problem Fig was solving. But we also kind of want Docker to be able to do this as well. So we're kind of figuring out how we can take some of the best bits from Fig, things like the concept of a service or a group of containers, and how Docker can be aware of those things as well. And maybe even a thing like Fig up, but built into Docker, like Docker up, where with a single command you could run your whole application. And Docker would have a way of describing this, of sort of how to connect together a few containers into a thing that runs. And again, this is still a work in progress. This GitHub issue has a bunch of work in progress code. It has some builds that you can try out if you want to play around with it, which are obviously very alpha, and some documentation about how it could work as well. And one of the cool things about grouping a composition like this, which is related to the clustering stuff that we're also working on, is that this will just talk to the Docker Remote API in the same way that Fig talks to the Docker Remote API. And the Docker cluster also just exposes the Docker Remote API. So one of the things this is going to do, unlike Fig, which normally just works for development environments because it talks to a single remote API endpoint, which is normally just a simple Docker daemon. In a clustering world, this will just start working across multiple machines. So in theory, this could not just be for development environments, this could also be a way of describing how your applications are structured in production, which is something that's very early stage, obviously, but it's something we want to sort of get feedback about and figure out how that's going to work for people's applications, and how we would be able to describe people's applications in a way that might be useful for running across multiple production environments. Because you really want to be able to describe I have a database, a work process, and a web server, and I want to start this on my local development environment, I want to start this in my CI system, I want to start this in my staging environment, and I want to start this in my production environment, all which might be different. Well, they are all different systems. They might also be different platforms, and they might be running, your production systems might be a bunch of EC2 machines managed by Bucket, and your CI system might be running on CoreOS or something, and you want all of these things to all work and still be able to describe how your infrastructure works in one place. If you're interested in that sort of stuff, please, go to this issue and see what we're working on. Now the thing I'm working on, which I'll also give a quick demo of, is called host management, which we have a thing at the moment called boot to Docker, which is kind of two things. It is partially a quite neat little hypervisor for running Docker containers. It's a 20 meg ISO. Actually, I think it might be 30 meg now. You sort of keep on adding things to it. But it's a really small ISO, which basically just runs a Docker daemon. It just boots up in about, I think it's about 15 seconds and starts a Docker daemon, and then you run Docker containers on it. The idea that once you have Docker, you don't really need to install it on the host machine because you can wrap everything up inside a Docker container. Boot to Docker is also a command line client, which is basically just a little command line client for running boot to Docker hosts. And this is really useful on OS 10, because OS 10 doesn't support containerization at the moment. So any Docker containers you have to run inside a virtual machine. So we've created this boot to Docker command line client to essentially boot up a boot to Docker VM and hook up a Docker client to it that's running on OS 10. So you can use Docker as if OS 10 supported containerization. And we thought it was a bit frustrating that this was a separate tool. We thought it would be, it's quite frustrating to tell people who want to try out boot to Docker, oh, so first you have to go over to this boot to Docker project and install boot to Docker and then start up a boot to Docker thing. And then you have to go and install Docker and then hook it up to be able to talk boot to Docker. And it's not a great experience if somebody just wants to try out Docker on their Mac. So we've sort of been trying to improve this, and the best way to show you how this works is probably to give you a demo. So I'm ready to go ahead. Can everyone see that? So, does everyone see that? Is that good?
Yeah.
So, in host management, how much time have I got, by the way? Oh, okay. With host management, basically, if you want to get started with Docker on OS 10, you grab the Docker binary and put it on your machine. And it's Docker binary, like you sort of, if you ever use Docker, this is probably familiar, but we've added a new subcommand called hosts. Which ships, like, by default with a host called defaults, which is just what Docker already does. But what we can do is using this hosts command, we can create new hosts directly from Docker itself. So I can say Docker hosts create on VirtualBox, which is the way that boot to Docker out of the box creates virtual machines. Create a new host called dev. And what this is going to do, from this single Docker binary that we downloaded from somewhere, from the Docker website, we can now sort of spawn off a Docker daemon running inside VirtualBox. And it's downloading boot to Docker, which is a VM, which is really small, that's quite quick. Creates an SSH key to be able to talk to it, it creates a virtual VM, and it's going to boot up. And this is what the boot to Docker command line client already does at the moment, but pretty much ported to be inside of the Docker client itself. Getting quick slide. And once this is created, it's then going to show up inside our list of hosts, which we had before, as a host this is running. And one thing it's done is that it's now been labeled called the active host. So before, if you set up a Docker daemon inside boot to Docker, you would have to set a bunch of environment variables so the client knew where the Docker daemon was. But now the Docker client is aware of what hosts are running and knows which one you want to talk to. So this is a bit like switching branches in Git. So you can switch to different Docker daemons that are running. So we've now selected dev, which is running, and we can do Docker things on it. So we can see that, oh, nothing's running on it, and we can run things on it. Which sort of, if you've used Docker, this is... Does anyone here actually not know what Docker is? I realise that's something I probably should ask at the start. Cool. Is there anyone who's heard of Docker but doesn't really know what it is? Cool. It's a way of packaging up software with all of its dependencies, so it'll run anywhere. So it's kind of a lightweight VM. You can also think of it as a lightweight VM, and you're making a bunch of ISOs, except it's just much more efficient than that. So what we're saying here is we're running inside an image called BusyBox, which is just in this case, it's a lightweight Linux distribution with Devops installed on it, just telling it to echo hello world inside that image, which is done. It's downloaded Devops and run that inside that image. So that's pretty much Docker. That's pretty much what it does. So we've got these hosts. But what we can also do, which is quite neat, and this is sort of a new thing, is we thought, okay, if you can create a host on VirtualBox, why can't you create a host anywhere? So we've also included drivers for creating hosts on cloud providers. So, for example, you could create a host on DigitalOcean. DigitalOcean, you need to be somebody. So I'm going to give it my access token and give it a name. So let's say this might be our staging environment. And it'll do kind of the same thing, except instead of creating VirtualBox host on your local machine, it will go off and create a DigitalOcean host on DigitalOcean. And also be quite slow, because this is actually boosting up a whole local machine. One thing to note about this is, or at least in the situation it is at the moment, is this is kind of, wouldn't really, like, you probably could create some production environments using this by creating a whole bunch of machines and sort of talking to them individually, but it's not really set up for that yet. It's kind of intended for the case where, you know, the boot to Docker case is really obvious, where I need a development environment for my local machine. But for production, it normally it would probably only make sense if you were working on sort of 12 projects in production. I want to host my WordPress blog somewhere, for example. But the intention is, and you can sort of imagine where this is heading, where it might become a useful tool for provisioning hosts in production. Particularly when Docker clustering might exist as well, you could provision a bunch of hosts that you then connect into a cluster and actually use as a production system. There we go, we've got staging. And if we look at Docker hosts again, we've got one of our hosts there, default, which isn't actually a host, that's just pointing at a unit socket, and VirtualBox, which we just created, which is still running, and a new DigitalOcean host. And if we look at this host, it is, well, it's not the same thing. But I can show you it's not the same thing. But we can do things like run Nginx. Really fast to pull because it's on DigitalOcean. And that will run Nginx. And there's also a command called docker hosts IP, which will give us the IP address of that machine, which we can then open in a web browser, and that's Nginx running on DigitalOcean, all from just this single Docker binary that we downloaded. And another cool thing we can do is we've got that running, the Docker PS. We can also Docker hosts active, which will select a new active host. So that's selecting my VirtualBox host again, and nothing's running on that because that was my local machine. And that's kind of how it works, and that's kind of what it is. It's still very much in the sort of design phase, and it's still a work in progress. So on that proposal there, going to host management, it's still lots of people discussing how does this work. There's also the code and a bunch of test builds. So if you want to try this out, you can download a test build and play around with it. But yes, if you're interested in any of these things, basically we really want you to get involved and start having a say about how it works. Because if you kind of want to use one of these things, and it's not, you don't like the design, then, we've messed up, and we should be building it for you. And indeed, if you want to get involved and actually contribute code, all of these things are just feature branches. So you can submit pull requests against these features and actually get involved in making it as well. which is quite exciting. And I guess, I have no idea how much time I've got, but one of the points of this, I have 5 minutes, so we have 5 minutes for questions, and if you want to get angry at any of these features, this is probably a good time to do that as well. Also, places to talk to me. ISC is a good place to also talk to me and be Firshman and everything. Yes?
I have a question. All these new features, I see them kind of being borrowed in a good way, in a sense, from other projects, like, for example, CoreOS. Do you guys feel that this is a way to just integrate those features into Docker so those projects don't have to do it anymore? And those projects can then leverage what Docker has?
No, so one of the things we want to do as Docker is we sort of kind of set standard APIs for talking to lots of things. So for example, with clustering, we kind of want to define an API so all of the systems like CoreOS and Mesos and Kubernetes and all these sorts of things. You can have a choice over what you use. So Docker is kind of an entry point for those sort of things, but we're not going to pretend that, you know, by the time we launch Docker cluster, that it's going to be as good as Mesos, because it's not. You know, Mesos has been building this thing and it runs Twitter for years. You know, we can't pretend to be as good as that. But what we do want to do is make something that works really well out of the box. So Mesos is really good, partially because it's also really complicated and there's a lot to running a cluster scheduler at scale. That's not really practical if you're a little startup and you've got 10 machines on EC2. It's not worth your time to set up a Mesos cluster. So we kind of also want to satisfy that case as well. So we're kind of figuring out ways where we can give you a single interface basically talking to those two things. And that's in theory what it's going to be.
Okay. I've actually got 3 things I'll just do them very quickly.
Oh,
The
sure.
first one, when you create your virtual box on command line, one thing that would be really useful there is you can actually specify how much memory the virtual box you're creating has got.
Yes.
So that's one thing.
I think that's actually a thing already.
Second thing, just looking at the GitHub clustering, it looks like it's talking about massive slave. If possible, having it so that there isn't a single master or anything like that, where you can actually just nominate a couple of things which that would be.
So we've been talking about either using stuff like etcd, or using etcds for Octa implementation directly. There's sort of a decision about whether because obviously a master slave thing is much simpler.
Yes.
But, you know, the downside of it is that there's a single point of failure. So we've been thinking about sort of in terms of MVP, whether we get out the thing first, which is a master slave system, and then make it work with multi-master later, or whether we do it
API
first.
enables to cater both. You do it as an API with plugin. And the third thing is AWS has announced a whole bunch of clustering and group
Yes.
stuff to about 2 hours.
Which is quite exciting. It's probably a bit too early for me to, I mean, it's like, sort of, read the press release 5 minutes before I got here. Yeah, no, that was really interesting. I don't know how technical it is. But things like the clustering thing, that is a really good example of where you obviously have opinions about this, and it would be really good if you put a comment on the proposal saying, I think it should work like this, because X, Y, and Z. And we'll totally take that into account because everyone knows outside the company knows collectively a lot more than we do inside the company, so we're trying to sort of gather that intelligence.
Thanks.
You want one last one? One last one. Docker inside OpenStack. As a driver, so I think it worked pretty well actually. Like particularly for people who already have OpenStack installations, it's a really great way of running Docker containers on that. I don't know a whole lot about OpenStack. I know that somebody's actually submitted OpenStack, opened a pull request for OpenStack against my host management stuff, which would be quite cool, because that will essentially mean you'll be able to create, if you've got an OpenStack cluster, you'll be able to create Docker machines on your your oversight cluster and stuff like that.
I was just instead of focusing on clustering, just use OpenStack.
Oh, right, yeah, totally. Well, you can do that, yes. The downside of using Docker on OpenStack is it doesn't have all the features of Docker. So one of the things we've got planned for Docker clustering is that it's actually going to speak the Docker API. So you can use all of the tools that are in the Docker ecosystem against the Docker cluster, which is not true for OpenStack. Cool, thank you everyone.